Good afternoon, everyone. It is David Schlotthauer here with another detailed tropical weather outlook and discussion for Father's Day Sunday, June the 15th, 2025. In this tropical weather outlook and discussion, we are monitoring the main development region for the potential for tropical development by the very end of June into early July, and I'll explain why that is when we look at our GFS and European models and explain why I think there might be a very narrow window for development. Now, with that being said, here's a look at the latest GOES 19 true color visible satellite imagery provided by Dr. Levi Cowan at tropicaltidbits.com. There will be a link in the description below this video. And as we take a look at the main development region right now over the Atlantic, we can see that there is a lot of dry, stable Saharan air, not necessarily dusty, but it is very dry and it is rather warm above the boundary layer. And when this occurs, we tend to get a lot of this stratocumulus type cloud formation, indicating to us that the air mass here is really stable and there is not a whole lot of convective turning right now. And we can even see some Saharan dust coming off of Africa, indicating that this part of the Atlantic is still quite stable. And that's likely due to the fact that we have a little bit of sinking air in the Atlantic and a little bit of unfavorable upper level winds. And then, of course, over here in the Caribbean and the Gulf, looking also really quiet, not much to worry about, although there is going to be quite a bit of heavy rainfall each afternoon over portions there of Nicaragua, Honduras, Belize, the Yucatan Peninsula, Costa Rica area over the coming days. Now, taking a look at the latest 12Z GFS model run, which stands for Global Forecasting System, and we're looking at a 3-plot system here. The color shading indicates how much spin we have in the atmosphere, known as cyclonic relative vorticity. And then, of course, our wind barbs here tell us how strong the wind is in the lower parts of the atmosphere, so at 5,000 feet, and which way the wind is blowing from. And then, of course, these height contours indicate where we are seeing higher levels of pressure at 850 millibars, which would otherwise indicate we have a ridge of high pressure, or where we have lower heights indicating lower pressure. So putting this into motion here over the next 24 or 36 hours, we can see that the whole dominant future so far throughout the whole entire month of May and now going into the middle of June has been this very persistent, very strong surface high, or known as the Bermuda high. And this has kept our trade winds very strong, stronger than they should be for this time of the year. But we got to understand that sometimes years like we have this year, we tend to get very strong trade winds, even in very busy hurricane seasons. 2020 was a great example of that, where we had a pretty strong, robust North Atlantic high that was able to establish itself. So kind of the same player here, where we have a strong Bermuda high as well as an Azores high, and this is contributing to those strong trade winds. But please don't let your guard down. This is only June, and we have a couple more months to go before we really get into the meat of the hurricane season, which tends to be the second half of August into September, when the Atlantic usually wakes up in a really big, fast way. So going all the way through the first day of summer here, pretty much the same thing. Very large, sprawling ridge of high pressure, keeping things very suppressed. These trade winds here are blowing anywhere between 20 to 30 knots, which is pretty dang strong for the middle of June. But again, it is pretty common to see that. And then going forward here, all the way throughout the next 10 days here for Wednesday, June 25th, 2025, we don't see anything that gets my attention, although there is a little bit of spin here on the far western side of that subtropical ridge, which is located here on this map. And the recent GFS model, the 06Z, did something pretty crazy with that. It actually showed that a tropical storm would be possible to form, but of course, that's an intermediate run, and intermediate runs of the GFS can spit out crazy things. So we're not concerned about that at all. But instead, when we take a look down here at the main development region, so roughly right in here, this is where we do have the potential for more stronger tropical waves that eventually might attempt at something to develop. Now, I'm not saying this to fearmonger, to cause panic at all. I'm looking for signals, and there are symptoms before actually something forms in the Atlantic. And in this case, what we're looking for here is any area of spin, or if it's elongated like we have right here. So here's another great example. So we have a trough that's anchored like this in the lower levels of the atmosphere. We got another tropical wave coming off of Africa. And this usually sets a tone that usually is a breeding ground for tropical wave formation or even a tropical depression when we get this collaborating of thunderstorms. In this case, we're not seeing that, but then look what happens here. We get another strong tropical wave that comes off of Africa here, but this is very far out in time, so I'm not really concerned about this at all. But there are some minute signals out there that do suggest that this area will need to be watched by the time we go into late June into very early July. Not that we will see a tropical storm or hurricane forming out here. It is still too early in the season to see hurricanes or even major hurricanes. But it's something to consider here that this area is going to start being the area to watch as we go into July and August, usually Cape Verde season or Cabo Verde season in that sense, as this high remains pretty dominant to the north. And some of you in the comment section as well as on X have said that just because we have a strong high out here means we will not see hurricanes this season. That is actually false. This high up here actually helps to develop tropical storms, especially off of Africa. And the reason why is when we get flow like this around this subtropical high like this in the lower levels, so we get enhanced easterly winds that come down out of the along the Iberian Peninsula. So they blow like this. But what you end up seeing is usually loose westerly winds, and sometimes they curve back like this into Western Africa. And what you end up seeing is what we call a slip wind shift, where we get enhanced easterlies here, where we get somewhat enhanced westerlies here. And so what you end up seeing is vorticity that gets stretched, and any of these vorticity areas that break off of these intertropical convergence zones usually become the seedlings or breeding ground for tropical wave development into tropical depressions or storms, especially if the background state is conducive. And that's what we are seeing right here. Enhanced easterly winds, very loose, light easterlies, sometimes westerly wind anomalies that set up here. So this is going to be the area to take note of as we go into early July. The European model is quite similar in this sense, not just the GFS showing this. So looking at the European model, we can see the same old pattern sets up here. Strong, sprawling Bermuda and Azores high to the north. Again, very typical for even in very busy hurricane seasons like we saw in 2020, how we had a really strong Bermuda high that brought a lot of dust off of Africa that did not smorf any development whatsoever, and we ended up with 31 named storms at the end of all of it. So what we end up seeing here is this vorticity, very strong easterly winds here, lighter winds, and even perhaps out of the westerly and southerly direction. So we end up seeing this lobe of vorticity right here. Now, this does not mean we will see tropical development by the very end of June into early July, but it's a symptom that we look for in busy seasons like this. Another tool that we could use to analyze the state of the atmosphere, not just at the surface, is the deep layer vertical wind shear. This is the deep layer vertical wind shear plot from the GFS model on Tropical Tidbits' website. The red ribbon of strong deep layer shear here is indicated in the black area that I've circled in. That is vertical wind shear greater than 40 to 60 knots. That is very unfavorable. We are not going to see anything forming underneath this belt of westerly flow and westerly wind shear. But instead, we're going to start looking down here where there is lighter vertical wind shear that is showing up here on the GFS model, only at around, say, 10 to 15 knots, which is deemed neutral to slightly favorable conditions for anything that can form. But fortunately, we do have a lot of drier air. Now, the deep layer vertical wind shear does increase. That is understandable through the first day of summer here. But after we get past the first day of summer into the latter part of very late June into early July, I want you to pay very close attention to what is coming off of Western Africa here. So we have westerly vertical wind shear doing this throughout the deep layer in the main development region. That's why things are stable, dry, no convection whatsoever. But watch what happens here as we go beyond the 10-day forecast all the way out into July 1st. Yeah, this is the 12Z July 1st forecast for Tuesday. And we can see here anticyclonic wind shear profiles here. We have easterly vertical wind shear here where we have winds doing this. Now, this does not help to develop tropical cyclones, but it means that any westerly vertical wind shear is actually going to get devoided and get shunted northward, so leaving this area quite conducive for tropical wave formation and not a tropical storm or hurricane instead. Another parameter that I like to show you all too in these videos, especially this time of the year, is to analyze how much moisture is in the deep layers of the atmosphere. So this look at the 10,000 foot to 32,000 foot layer. So again, blending all the layers together, we get an average relative humidity forecast. And the brown colors indicate that the air mass here is very dry, unfavorable, and there's a lot of shear to help along with that. So that's why we are not seeing a whole lot of tropical waves or any convection coming off of Africa right now. But as we go forward here, you can see that there are tropical waves here, but they're not very strong. So here's one right here. You can see the ending or the leading edge of that wave moving across the Atlantic. That's, again, very weak indeed. Nothing to be concerned about. And then look at here, especially in about 10 days. This is a very dry atmosphere. I mean, you don't see this very often. And so that's why we're not concerned about any development here. But watch what happens later on. We start getting more moisture piling up here, and we end up seeing our first really big tropical wave coming off of Africa. But of course, this is one singular model. This is not an ensemble forecast, and a lot can change between model runs. So like the 12Z GFS is going to be different than what the 18Z is going to show, and then what the 0Z is going to show. I want you all to understand that this is not a single forecast. This is not a solidified forecast by any means, and this is subject to change in subsequent model runs. The GFS runs 4 times a day at 06Z, 12Z, 18Z, and 0Z again. So that completes a model run cycle of 4 consecutive runs. And each run has a different outcome. But you can see in general, while we do see tropical waves coming off of Africa that are pretty aggressive, the background state here is quite dry and unfavorable, but that is going to change. What we don't want to see is too much moisture over northern Africa. That's what smorfed the season and made it play out below expectations than what we were thinking last year, if that makes sense. So we are on par. This is normal. This is not unusual at all. And so people that are posting things that, oh, this season's going to be a bust, it's not going to be active at all because the Atlantic is running cooler than it was last year. We have to understand that last year was a crazy, crazy sea surface temperature pattern, something that we have never seen at all in modern records. So to add to more validity to this forecast, I wanted to show you all Dylan Federico's X post here that he released just a few hours ago. And he did state here, let's pump the brakes on comparing the Atlantic hurricane season to 2014. The MDR and overall Atlantic basin is significantly warmer this year than it was in 2014. And that season gave us 9 total storms, which was a below average season. But I don't want you all to focus on the numbers, okay? Numbers don't mean anything here, and it's all about quality over quantity. Quality as in ace-producing storms. We could have 6 major hurricanes, and that's all we see for the season. That's only 6 named storms, but will those 6 impact you is the question, right? And so when we compare this to 2014, this was a sea surface temperature profile. Take note, there was not as much warmth in the Atlantic overall. It was near average. Okay, look at the main development region. Look at the Caribbean, below average here, despite the fact that we had a developing El Nino here. We remember that Godzilla El Nino was a big thing that year, while the Atlantic was like, whoa, not really much at all, not much warmth. Now let's put it to this year. And we can see less of an El Nino signal, and we have more warm neutral conditions out there right now, more like actually cool neutral. Retrospect, a very negative PMM, which stands for Pacific Meridional Mode. So that's very negative. Even down here as well is below average to near average sea surface temperatures versus the Atlantic as a whole running above normal, which means when you look at the two basins, one's going to dominate the other. And right now, the Atlantic is far warmer than the Eastern Pacific as a whole. And therefore, there is still a strong correlation here that this season is going to be at least slightly to somewhat above average. I am predicting right now at least 11 to 16 named storms. I have a rough range because there is a mixed signal, but there is definitely a signal here in the Atlantic that does ask a big question that the season will be at least somewhat above average. If that's 14 named storms, 15 named storms, 18 named storms, 20 named storms, it's not really going to matter. What's really going to matter is who's going to get impacted. Where are you going to get impacted is the big question. How much ACE points do we get this year? Numbers do not matter. So with that being said, the Gulf is really running far above average, one of the warmest basins out of the main development region. The Caribbean is running above average as well. So that's unfortunately a plus here. So running above average in two basins. And really in the last week or so, the main development region here has really warmed up quite significantly despite the slightly stronger than normal trade wind flow that we are seeing, likely being fueled by this very warm Iberian Peninsula current. All that warmer water is being fed into the MDR, and that's going to generally fuel a busy season. So long story short, bottom line here, the sea surface temperature configuration here is, while it is a mixed signal for either a near average season or a slightly below or slightly above average season, it's not going to matter because we're looking at more quality over quantity this year. So we are more than likely going to see more stronger storms this year than we did in 2014, certainly. And that's a big problem. Will those strong storms hit you? Now, when looking at the Gulf, sorry, my face disappeared there. You can see very warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf, more than warm enough to support intense hurricanes, okay, like we saw last year with Milton, like we saw with Helene. They were very impactful hurricanes that came through the Gulf. So we don't want to underestimate how warm the Gulf is. And it is more than enough to support intense hurricanes. Now, looking at the main development region, looking at the rest of the Atlantic here, like we just talked about, the Gulf and the Caribbean, more than warm enough. And just to FYI for those people that are watching this, anything greater than 26 Celsius is indeed 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what you need to sustain hurricanes or even intense hurricanes. And this whole area here in orange and yellow is indeed favorable for intense hurricanes. It's only a matter of time when the atmosphere, when the background state cooperates with these sea surface temperatures. So indeed, we are there where it's just the waiting game, all right? So we have to understand that just because we're not seeing anything now does not mean that we should just say, oh, the season's not going to perform at all. Let's ignore it. Let's not get prepared, because that's a pretty foolish thing to do. So now the tropical cyclone heat potential anomaly here is outrageous, concerningly high, especially in the Gulf here, where it is very, very high for this time of the year. The loop current especially is running well above where it should be for this time of the year. However, the only good news that I have in this video is that the upper ocean heat content over here across the central and eastern Caribbean is running slightly below average, but that, don't let your guard down, okay? For one thing, the Caribbean is not notorious for intense hurricanes because it is basically what would I call it? Basically, it is a cyclone shredder. You get strong trade winds through this portion of the Caribbean with upper level westerly winds or sometimes weaker easterly winds, and that leads to a lot of deep layer vertical wind shear and some drier air. So the Caribbean usually not notorious for anything significant. It's usually the southwestern Atlantic, the Gulf and the east or western, the southwestern and the western Atlantic that tends to get more of the activity. Not to mention, though, the Caribbean can. It's usually not until we get into, say, early to mid-September when the Caribbean usually starts getting busy. Other basins start usually a little earlier. So therefore, there is more than enough upper ocean heat content. If there is upper ocean heat content like yellows and greens, there is energy for intense hurricanes here. So with that being said, the question remains, when will we see another favorable window for opportunity in the Atlantic? Well, when looking at the North Carolina tropical weather forecast here, as far as your upper velocity potential here, which is really cool to see. Green colors usually indicate negative velocity potentials, which means there's rising motion, and brown colors indicate there's some sinking motion. So we just went through a favorable period over the Eastern Pacific. Things look to be winding down there over the next week or two, and that's because there is going to be some sinking air that's going to rotate over the basin. Now, when we look at this area down here, with the blue circled areas, those are Kelvin waves. So convective coupled Kelvin wave potential is moving into the Atlantic as we go into the very end of June into early July is what we expect here to see on the GFS. More vorticity, more spin in the atmosphere over the intertropical convergence zone, stronger tropical waves, and a more conducive upper level environment, especially in the first couple of days of July. So therefore, it's not favorable here, but it's going to be potentially favorable here in the very, very end of June into early July. And we have to be ready just in case if something does develop and takes full advantage of the favorable background state. Now, the last thing that I wanted to do before wrapping up the video here is where are we in relation to where we're headed for the Atlantic hurricane season? Well, just FYI, and a huge important note here is on this given day, Father's Day, June 15th, there has not been one hurricane that has formed on this very day. 0 hurricanes with only 5 named storms since 1944. All right, that means the chances to get a named storm on this very day is really, really low, and it is not very likely that you see any activity here. And therefore, the National Hurricane Center put this out yesterday, letting everyone know that the Atlantic Basin remains quiet with tropical cyclone development not expected over the next week. The lack of early season activity, okay, isn't unusual. So again, it's not like, oh, we're going to see a busted season just because it's dead out there. It's only June, folks. Please be patient. The 15th, it's Father's Day. It's not Labor Day. It's not early September. This isn't unusual. On average, the first named storm of the season forms around June 20th. In fact, between 1991 and 2020, the period we use to define what's normal, the first storm didn't form until July or even early August. Okay, in 8 out of the last 30 years, roughly a quarter of the time that occurred. So it's not unusual to see this map that you see here, okay? So don't get all caught up saying, oh, this is going to be a busted season because we're not seeing any activity. Please chill. It's only middle of June, and we have all of July. We have pretty much all of August before we start wondering why the season is not active. And usually we should not even be asking that question until we get into early or even the middle of September. Last year was understandable because we saw this in early September. Now that's going to sum it up for today's detailed tropical weather outlook and discussion for Father's Day Sunday, June the 15th, 2025. Have a great rest of your day. Please celebrate, have some fun tonight, eat out with your father, go to a restaurant, a famous restaurant. Ours over here is Pietro's, which is a great restaurant to eat at. But anyways, have a great time with your fathers, and I'll be back with you guys tomorrow with another detailed tropical weather outlook and discussion, and I will be trying to make these every single day. So if you have not subscribed, please do so. It really does help out the channel a lot. Otherwise, be back tomorrow with another tropical update.